Philip Howard is Professor of Internet Studies at Oxford University. He's also the director of the Oxford Internet Institute, who were the first to discover fake news as a phenomenon during the 2016 Brexit referendum and the US presidential election. His knowledge has been sought by the US Senate, the European Commission, and the UK government. On misinformation trends, he's the author of many academic papers, and his latest book is Lie Machines: How to Save Democracy from Troll Armies, Deceitful Robots, Junk News Operations, and Political Operatives. Welcome, Phil. What types of harm do lies, misinformation, and fake news do to a democracy?
Lies can travel far. They can go much farther than truths. And there are two kinds of harms that such political lies have. The first is that they give voters the wrong information at the time when they need high-quality information. Most voters don't make up their minds about how they'll vote until 3 days before Election Day. And that's the sensitive moment when misinformation can really have an impact on how people think. The second kind of impact is on politicians themselves. We all want our political leaders to use evidence when making their decisions. But a good misinformation campaign can get criticism, can get critique, can get a political leader to doubt what their experts and their own staff are telling them, and sometimes that can derail a sensible political conversation.
Don't all politicians actively spread misinformation, whether they're conservative, socialist, or running a totalitarian state? Is the real problem here that the fact that the wrong people have mastered digital tools that make them more effective with it?
Well, most politicians certainly put on spin. They love to spin things. Political parties do this too. So do unions, so do civil society groups, so do journalists. But beyond that, there's a level of lying, of creating facts, creating misinformation, making up entire stories, launching large campaigns that perpetuate myths. That's the nasty stuff that really undermines civil discourse in a democracy.
So that leads me to troll armies. I love that phrase. Who funds them and what are they trying to achieve?
Well, troll armies involve dozens of people who usually sit at home. They each manage dozens of fake social media accounts. These will be fake British voters or fake American voters. And these voters will put out content from their family, their fake dogs, until they're needed and somebody hires them to start advocating for a political position or advocating for a particular candidate for office. Now, the people who pay for this stuff are the political consultants and lobbyists of this world. Sometimes a politician will hire a troll army to work for them. In some of our research, we've actually found that it's big oil and pharmaceuticals. There's several large industries that pay big money to hire troll farms to push their products and push their politics.
Widespread misinformation became public knowledge after the Oxford Internet Institute published alleged interference by Russia in the US elections. And then there was the Brexit vote. And then there was the role of Cambridge Analytica, that everybody was and still is using the most detailed data that they can get their hands on. Why has that been such a big deal?
We didn't know that the big Silicon Valley firms and all their advertising partners were harvesting huge volumes of data about our opinions, about our behaviors. This data is behavioral in the sense that it also tracks what we actually do and maps that with our preferences. And then the major firms will sell that data to firms like Cambridge Analytica for their analysis and the reporting that they'll do to political consultants.
You were careful there not to use the word Facebook.
Facebook is certainly the largest platform, but there's much more than Facebook, right? Facebook is an important part of the story in 2016 and 2018. But these days, young people develop their political identities online, and they use Instagram, they use TikTok, they use platforms that my generation doesn't really use. And so it's much bigger than just Facebook. It involves Google search, it involves YouTube. Pretty much anything that can track data about your life can render political inferences. I can learn something from what you do and make some guesses about how you'll vote.
So give me some idea of the types of research that you've been involved in.
Some of the most interesting research we do involves figuring out what foreign governments do to voters in democracies on election day. For the most part, that has involved countries like Russia, countries like Iran. These countries will launch a campaign against the candidates that are running for office in another democracy. The UK, Europe, France, the United States, Canada, Australia, most modern democracies have had some form of electoral interference from one of these authoritarian regimes. Usually the politicians that an authoritarian regime goes after are the politicians who would be really hardline, really conservative in international relations.
Can you give us some idea of any new or surprising insights that you've gained from the research that you've been doing?
One of the things that really surprised us in doing all of this research is the size of the problem and the size of the economy of the problem. So renting fake Facebook voters costs tens of thousands of dollars or pounds a week. There are multiple organizations, businesses, firms that manage fake Facebook profiles, fake Twitter users, and they sell their services to firms all around the world. They sell their services to foreign governments. And interestingly, we found that many foreign governments have their own in-house consultants. Sometimes these are military units that are retasked to do social media manipulation. Sometimes they just hand out contracts to advertising firms. These firms will hire dozens of young people to develop programs to attack politicians in the West or to promote certain ideologies to discourage us from voting on election day.
So it's really a new form of lobbying then?
It is, but it's much more pernicious than that. In most democracies, we have lobbying rules. We know who the lobbyists are. There's a little bit of transparency about how the money flows. We really don't see how the money flows in these kinds of problems. More than that, we don't really see what kind of data they use. The best data on public life in every major country is not held in that country. It's not held in the national library system. It's held in Silicon Valley. It's held in the cloud computing platforms that Facebook, Google, YouTube, Instagram, WhatsApp, all of these firms maintain huge troves of information about their users. They have the best quality data about public policy problems and public attitudes.
We're both in isolation, we're working from home. Can you give some examples of perhaps some malicious and politically motivated misinformation about COVID-19?
Well, in the research we've been doing, it seems that there's a coordinated campaign to get many people in democracies to not believe that there's a COVID crisis, to think that the coronavirus pandemic is a myth or won't affect them or is affecting other countries. Based on the propaganda we've seen, we think this is about undermining our faith in our political institutions, undermining our confidence in our political leadership. And it's a big problem because it means that many of us who believe this stuff won't protect ourselves. We'll put ourselves at risk by going out in public, not respect the stay-at-home guidelines. Some of these campaigns are even encouraging people to go and protest against the political leaders who are encouraging us to stay at home and let the healthcare workers do their jobs. Here in the UK, one of the most important, one of the biggest myths at the moment is this story that 5G towers are spreading the coronavirus in some way. And it's become a big problem because people are being encouraged to go and set the towers on fire. There are Facebook groups that are trying to produce citizen maps, citizen-generated maps of 5G towers so that civic groups can know where they are and become activists against the spread of the technology. There's no evidence that 5G promotes coronavirus. And 6 months ago, the myth about 5G was that 5G was killing bees. So there's actually some persistent myths that Wi-Fi, that technologies, that laptops are posing health risks to us, and they're simply distracting from the big public issues, the things that we can do constructively to fight the coronavirus.
I said in the introduction that you consult at the highest levels in the US, the UK, and in the EU. What are they most interested in or worried about?
The highest levels of government in the EU, the UK, and the US are most interested in the kinds of misinformation that directly threatens democracy. So the kinds of misinformation that targets voters, that discourages voters from showing up, whether you're liberal or conservative or centrist, pretty much everybody can agree in a democracy that we want election day to work well. The other thing that major political leaders are wary of in misinformation is misinformation that originates from authoritarian regimes, such as Russia or Iran. When those kinds of governments pick or try to pick their favorite candidates in an election in a democracy, that's trouble. That's a mode of interference.
That's the perspective from our political leaders. But what about ordinary people? And the reason I say that, I was quite shocked when I read that you write about managed citizens. How are we all managed? And for what purpose?
Well, we're all managed in the sense that the data we leave behind us when we use our credit cards, we make our purchases online, all of that data goes towards making political inferences. And then politicians, major lobby groups will buy those data sets, crunch the numbers, and try to figure out who you are, what you'll vote for, what will get you out to voting day, or what will keep you at home. And there's many examples of how this works. If you've bought contraceptives on your credit cards, you're not pro-life, you're pro-choice. And the pro-choice lobby wants that data. If you've never bought contraceptives, then the odds are you probably are pro-life. And the pro-life lobby wants that data. So the same kinds of inferences can be made indirectly from your gasoline purchases, where you purchase your gas, what kind of car you're driving. All of that will tell us something about your class, your level of education, perhaps even directly who you're voting for.
We've all got beliefs and we've all got inherent biases. When we see something that we want to believe, are we more likely then to believe it and then less likely to check it and then more likely to spread it?
Certainly. One of the problems here is with the human brain itself. We all have these cognitive biases. And Facebook, social media firms, are designed to take advantage of those cognitive biases, to show us information that we'll respond well to. There's behavioral research that suggests that women respond well to men with a deep voice, and men respond well to women with a high-pitched voice. So if I can design a political ad that will put somebody with the ethnic background, the language tics, the gender that I'll respond well to, that's worth producing, right? If you want to get voters to vote for you, you put a person they'll recognize in front of you, and you're more likely to get their votes.
Fake news originally meant news that isn't true, but it seems to have morphed into anything that's reported in the mainstream media that some political leaders don't like or don't want people to hear. How much is that undermining democracy?
Fake news certainly undermines democracy, and it's a tough thing to study. It's a tough thing to analyze. We've generated multiple reports now for foreign governments, for major news organizations, for civil society groups. It turns out that it's very difficult to fact-check a fact-checking process. So rather than speak of fake news, we tend to speak of junk news. This is information that is conspiratorial, sensationalist, extremist, or it's content that's really editorial. It's commentary presented as news, maybe using the BBC colors or using the New York Times font. And this stuff is what circulates on fake news sites with branded content that appears to be credible, but in fact is not. And there's such large volumes out there that it's an important public policy problem now.
So what's easier to spot, a lie or the truth?
This is a tough question. I think it's easier to spot the truth because most people have a rough sense of what credible sources are. For most people, BBC, the CNN, the WHO, the CDC, there are major organizations that are more or less credible, don't make big mistakes, and present high-quality news and information. At the same time, many of us are intrigued by conspiracies. If we get a teaser of a story that seems to offer the inside truth or a behind-the-scenes look at what's really going on, that's tempting content. And so fake news that comes with this conspiratorial edge often finds a big audience.
But isn't that interesting that anything that's now labelled as a conspiracy theory is shorthand to say completely dismiss it, don't think about it, it's not worthy of any consideration at all. Whereas some conspiracy theories actually do deserve a closer investigation, perhaps.
I think there's a difference between investigative journalism, which involves a lot of care, a big professional team, an extended process, and editors who check everything and will spike a story if it doesn't materialize. There's a big difference between that kind of investigative work and what goes on in fake news. Increasingly, fake news actually has very little to do with politics. More and more, it's industry specific. So corporate partners will commission fake news stories to have an impact on other corporate partners. The amount of misinformation that has to do with industry, corporate espionage, stock shares, the prices of stocks, this stuff is really burgeoning now too.
The other side of misinformation is censorship. For example, if you ask any one of the hundreds of millions of young Chinese citizens what they think of the Tiananmen Square massacre, where thousands of pro-democracy students and supporters in Beijing were slaughtered, they won't know what you're talking about simply because it's been erased from internal Chinese history. And those that do know about it are too scared to say anything about it. So how is that possible?
Censorship in China is a big problem, and they have the unique advantage of having replicated almost every social media service we have in the West on their own, so that they can monitor. They've basically built state surveillance systems into their Twitter equivalent, their Facebook equivalent. Now, that makes it much easier for them to track every message, to roll out facial recognition technologies when they need it. When there's a crisis, the Chinese state is able to respond in a way that's often pretty effective. It is still a police state, right? So the range of responses include suppressing a lot of human rights. There are still these moments, these really interesting moments, where the system doesn't work well. The Hong Kong protests from about 6 months ago really woke up, I think, a younger generation of Hong Kong citizens who hadn't grown up in Hong Kong as a democracy. And they were actually able to use social media in very innovative ways to organize their own protests. Now, protest is certainly on hold because of what's happening with the health crisis. But China itself can't always maintain the calm social solidarity that they project, because people will use technologies to express themselves and stand up for themselves.
Do you think it's remotely possible that democracies will ever stop or slow down these sorts of lies?
I think democracies will need to work hard to slow down the spread of political lies, because in many cases, doing that work, trying to stop the spread of political lies, involves making decisions about which politicians are lying, what a lie is, and the work involves punishing political figures who spread misinformation. Now, most countries do have rules about what a politician, a public figure, can say. The United States does not have rules, and so American voters are in a unique position. They certainly have the freedom of the press and the many speech freedoms. Lies don't really have constitutional protections, but it's hard in the context of the US to see how they'll sort this out.
George Orwell wrote 1984, which is one of the first dystopian novels. Did he get things right, or do you think he dramatically underestimated the scale of surveillance and control in society?
I think it's an open question, because the COVID crisis is making many governments revisit some of these surveillance technologies for public health reasons. And I think over the next 6 months, year, 2 years, we're going to see how much surveillance governments roll out to protect the public. And then we're going to see whether governments roll those techniques, those surveillance techniques, back. I think the big troves of data that sit in Silicon Valley will start to be used by our medical systems. They'll be used by health researchers. Once a cure is on its way, we're on top of the virus, we've got things under control, it'll be a real test for our modern democracies to see if political leaders can roll back, can curtail their use of surveillance technologies.
as wide as this information is today, we're possibly just at the beginning of it, because there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence at the moment. And being a world leader in AI is a stated goal by the Chinese Communist Party, for example. In what ways can and will AI be used to perhaps undermine democracies by spreading even more and targeted misinformation to billions of these managed citizens you talk about?
Artificial intelligence is definitely going to have a role in misinformation trends in the years ahead. But I think it may have two kinds of roles, and I don't know which one will come to dominate. The first role for AI is in producing better misinformation. Right? If an artificial intelligence, if sophisticated machine learning tools can take your credit card data, some analytics from your social media commentary, and compose a political face that you'll respond well to, and use that political face, a fake image, a fake video, to draw you out on voting day or to encourage you to stay home, some lobbyist will pay for that work. But artificial intelligence won't just be working for major governments or big political parties. It's quite possible that we as citizens will have our own access to machine learning tools, that we as citizens will be able to use AI to sort out the high-quality news from the dreck, and there may be applications that would make us better, more sophisticated, more engaged citizens. That's the hopeful part of the story.
What fascinates you on a personal level about this subject?
The big surprise for me, researching this stuff over the last few years, was watching how authoritarian governments use misinformation to control their own people. I was living in Budapest in the summer of 2014 when the Malaysian Airlines flight was shot down over Ukraine, and I watched my Hungarian friends get three kinds of ridiculous stories. We were pretty sure that they had Russian origins. The first story was that Americans shot the plane down. The second story was that democracy advocates shot the plane down because they thought Putin was flying commercial from Amsterdam to Malaysia. The third story was about a lost tank from World War II that had come out of the great forests of Ukraine confused and accidentally shot the plane down. Now, that's when we realized that the real technique here is not so much in putting out one story that everyone can react to. It's about seeding multiple, conflicting, sometimes equally ridiculous stories. And the real surprise for us was to see this communication technique going from being something that authoritarian leaders used on their own people to being something that dictators used on voters in democracies, and then become something that politicians in democracies use on their own voters. It's that transfer of that technique that has really surprised me over the last few years. The real reward here is to try to polarize the public, to try to divide the public, to get many different segments to believe different things. That lets you as a political leader be selective and purposeful, and groom your public. Democracy is strong when voters choose politicians. It's always weak when the politicians get to choose their voters.
Sounds like your future career is pretty much assured then.
I think there's going to be large volumes of misinformation generated for years ahead and targeted at particular people. But we want the social media firms to behave well, behave responsibly, to make good decisions about what content to spread and what content to not allow on their platforms. I think there is a real opportunity for citizens to express themselves with new technologies. And I want to go back to that day when we all were excited about the latest technology, the latest way of learning about the world, and the latest way of participating in politics.
Professor Philip Howard, thank you very much.
This has been a great interview. Thank you very much.